Thank you for joining us on America's Roundtable, a weekly program from Washington, D.C., with leaders from business, media, think tanks, and the political arena. I'm your co-host, Joel Anand Sami, joined by Natasha Savdorch, co-founder of the International Leaders Summit and former contributor to the Economist Intelligence Unit, and guest co-host, Becky Norton Dunlop, former director of President Ronald Reagan's White House Cabinet and the vice president at the Heritage Foundation. Today, we're delighted to have join us Alvin Rabushka. Dr. Alvin Rabushka is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He is the author and co-author of numerous books in the areas of race and ethnicity, aging, taxation, state and local government finances, the flat tax, and economic development.
I was just wondering who have been major supporters, because we know that in the past there were both sides of the political spectrum that supported the flat tax.
Times change. One of the most beneficial things that has happened in our lifetime is the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And in the collapse of the Soviet Empire, all of the countries which have emerged, some 15, which were initially integral parts of the Soviet Union, emerged as independent countries. But having been communist countries where the government basically allocated all the expenditure and collected all the revenue of all enterprises and individuals, and in moving to a market economy, they needed to move to a tax system based on a market economy. Some, like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, moved immediately to flat tax. Others, like Russia, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so forth, installed the graduated tax rates of Western Europe, but subsequently changed them to adopt the flat tax like the first three Baltic states. And since 1993, something exactly between 34 and 35 countries have adopted a flat tax, replacing their previously multiple rate graduated tax systems. What's been astonishing is the results. So if you look at Estonia, for example, they have absolutely no public debt. And many of the other countries with flat tax rates have lower public debts than the gigantic industrial Western democratic economies. So the flat tax has been very good for growth, very beneficial for revenue. It's reduced the need to borrow, and some of these countries have recovered much more quickly from the financial crisis of the last few years than those in Western Europe in particular, which face the prospects of even greater difficulty in the months and years ahead. This lesson, however, has not crossed the border between Western and Eastern Europe. Most of the individual finance ministers and prime ministers in Central and Eastern Europe lived under communism, have lived under the flat tax, and those under the flat tax today see that their economies are more attractive for investment and work than the neighboring countries, which have these graduated tax rates and complicated tax codes and systems. And they are very reluctant to surrender those flat tax rates and flat tax systems, even under pressure from the International Monetary Fund, Harvard University economists, the World Bank, and other agencies, because they have been living with it. People find it easier to comply. Corruption and the black market has shrunk dramatically. However, people in the West still believe that they are advanced, they are modern, they are richer, and they should afford to have much more of a welfare state system, which needs high tax.
I believe also what you mentioned previously about the political favoritism. We had an example of a company, a very large American company, that did not pay any taxes last year because it lobbied for tax exemptions in exactly those areas that were affecting it. Don't you think that's one of the main reasons for keeping this complicated tax code in the U.S.?
If we went to a system of a low flat tax with no exemptions, credits, deductions, or loopholes except for the expensing of business investment, everybody would be treated equally. No one would be able to get a specific benefit or subsidy because they're doing wind power or solar power or any other special arrangement. This would give, I believe, everyone confidence that we're going to be treated fairly and equally, and also thereby help to reduce tax avoidance and tax evasion. Exactly. When we're told that a particular company doesn't pay any taxes, then what we're told is that people are greedy, companies are bad, and so forth. But this is only because they respond to take advantage of opportunities and lobby. 1980, when Robert Hall and I wrote the book, we took a look at the number of lawyers in Washington, D.C., and they've grown by 10,000 almost every decade. So that by about 1980, there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 70,000 lawyers in Washington, D.C., then the same number in New York. The difference was in New York, they practiced law, and in Washington, D.C., they tended to lobby the government for special benefits. So what has happened is the law, bigger the tax code, the more complicated the tax code, the more it creates opportunities for lobbying. But also, and this is very important and very few people pay attention to it, almost everyone who served in Congress, from being an elected member to being a staff member, then tends to go into a private enterprise business in which a consequence of being in this business is that they enjoy enormous salaries and income lobbying the very members of Congress that they originally worked for. So you have this revolving door of people working in the government, actually writing the tax laws, and then leaving and going to work for the lobbying firms to exploit the tax laws, to further influence the writing of them, go back into government and come back out. With a simple flat tax, and the Hall-Rabushka flat tax is only 4 pages long, there's no opportunity for any of this as opposed to the current 90,000-page tax code, which is many, 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 many times the length of the Bible.
Thank you for listening to America's Roundtable, a weekly program from Washington, D.C. Today we're joined by Dr. Alvin Rabushka, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Dr. Rabushka, I have a question in regard to what is transpiring in Asia. We have seen in Hong Kong a flat tax rate of some 16%, and Mauritius, which implemented the flat tax, and in studies like the Index of Economic Freedom, has certainly done much better than other countries connected to Africa. And for both India and China, which have benefited from the flat tax of Hong Kong and Mauritius, we've seen growth and investments coming in through those channels. What do you think are some of the most important or the obstacles that we see in trying to implement real tax reform in the United States?
The United States has, since 1916, almost, but not quite, a full century, 100 years of living with the income tax. And while the income tax rates tended to go up during wartime, they were usually reduced when peace returned. So the high rates of World War I were lowered in the 1920s. But the high rates of World War II were not really lowered after World War II. And the whole concept of Roosevelt's welfare state, which called for a dramatic expansion in government entitlements, subsidies, programs, direct work programs, meant that the revenue collected was to be deployed. So that in 1929, the level of government in state, federal, local, came to 10% of the national income, and today it runs 32, 33, 34%. The federal government in 1929 was 3% of the national income, and today it's well over 25% of the national income, which means we've had a 7 to 8-fold increase in the relative size of the federal government as a share of the economy. State and local government has doubled from about 7% to 15%. So at all levels, government has expanded dramatically, but most dramatically at the federal level, where we've built such entitlements to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, workers training programs, unemployment benefits, federal farm subsidies, educational subsidies, transportation subsidies. It goes on, and every one of these programs builds up a constituency of voters, special industries, of congressmen, of staff members, lobbyists, and they're very hard to roll back, reduce, or eliminate. So combining all of these interests and having a 96-year-old program in place and having a left-wing ideology dominate in the universities, in Hollywood, in the mainstream media, quite a large representation in left-leaning think tanks that basically represent people who work in Democratic administrations, and so on, means that it's an eternal, constant struggle to try to contain the growth of government and doubly hard to try to rule it back. I believe that to get something as profound as the flat tax in the United States will require some kind of serious economic crisis in which the need for a simple tax system to collect revenue overwhelms the ideological opposition and the interest group opposition. This may not happen in our lifetime. It may happen. But that's why I have focused most of my work in the last 25 to 30 years in spreading the gospel in Central and Eastern Europe, in Africa, in Asia, and I'm still hoping that there will be some breakthroughs in the future, maybe in Western Europe, maybe in Canada, to slowly move China in that direction. But for the moment, the big hope is that more and more of these emerging economies will see the benefits of a low, simple flat tax and move in that direction.
Your proposal for the flat tax in 1981 was 19% for personal and business income, the flat tax rate. You claimed it was a revenue-neutral tax reform, which would mean that the tax revenue would have remained the same just 1 year after the implementation. So there was no risk of reducing government revenues abruptly, just 1 year after the implementation. Isn't that a valid argument? There's no risk of failing. And what would be, would 19% still be the rate that you would implement today for a revenue-neutral tax reform?
In response to your early question about dynamic versus static analysis of the benefits of revenue from a flat tax, after the first year, the revenue would grow faster than if we didn't make the change to the flat tax, which means there would be more revenue, either to spend or to reduce borrowing to contain the deficit. So there not only is no risk, there's an immediate revenue benefit that would show up 2, 3, and every year after that, because the economy would be growing at a higher rate, and thus the pace of economic activity would continue to grow from such a change in the tax system. So on that score alone, I think one makes the argument that there's no risk in moving to that adjustment, as you indicated.
The known supporters of the flat tax from both sides of the political spectrum.
In the 1980s, there was considerable support from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. In fact, I have a collection in my file of editorials which were written by the Washington Post and the New York Times supporting the flat tax, along with the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, Financial Times. The Economist supported the flat tax some years ago. But these ideas tend to come and go. And years ago, I think it's important to remember that we had 3 national newspapers, 3 national television stations. We didn't have cable television. We didn't have talk radio. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have the blogosphere. And we didn't have Twitter and Facebook. So back then, an article in the Wall Street Journal that was persuasive got a lot of national attention. Today, an article in the Wall Street Journal is just one of 100 million news stories that comes out every day. And finding these needles in a haystack and keeping them active is very difficult. So that a good idea today very often runs against a very strong interest in the part of the media tomorrow to report on what comes up tomorrow. It's very difficult to sustain interest in one good idea. That's why I've tried to spend probably half of my professional life in the last 30 plus years pushing this one idea, first in the United States and then around the globe, just continuing to make the argument over and over and over and over again I've done it at conferences you hosted. I've done it at other conferences all throughout Eastern Europe. I've done it at numerous events in Western Europe and the United States. Because I believe unless one continues to push this idea, it will be gradually swamped and drowned out by other ideas, and then it's very hard to keep one's focus. I appreciate very much this opportunity we've had today to talk once again about the flat tax, and perhaps as we approach this so-called fiscal cliff and the need for tax reform and the problems with the deficit, that once again people will take some of the principles from the flat tax and make those the basis for a comprehensive tax reform that all parties on both sides of the political spectrum believe is necessary.
For those of our listeners who are interested in learning more about the flat tax, where would you guide them to visit as far as a website is concerned or material to read?
The best way to do this is either to use a search engine like Google and simply type my name into it, so you'll have to indicate slowly how to spell it. And on my bio page, which is the very first thing, there will be a link to the flat tax book. Another way is to simply do a blog search for the flat tax, and my blog on the flat tax will be the first one to come up, and again, there's a link to the book. And I should indicate that we have arranged for the Hoover Press to put this book online, so anybody who wants to learn more can open each of the chapters in the book and print them and download them. So while some may want to buy the book, in fact, the book is available free. And on my flat tax blog, so if one typed in flat tax blog, I've posted dozens and dozens of articles about all the different countries that have adopted the flat tax and their features. So that would be a very good way to start learning about it.
This was a great in-depth analysis, and I'm sure that our listeners are going to appreciate to know more about the flat tax. And I would just take this moment to spell your name as you kindly suggested. Dr. Alvin Rabushka is at Hoover Institution, and his last name is spelled Rabushka.
That's correct.
Great.
And there are very few Rabushkas in the country, so they will get to me right away.
Wonderful indeed. Thank you, Dr. Rabushka, for joining us, and we wish you the very best. And as we've seen the flat tax grow in Eastern Europe and now taking hold in other parts of the world, we trust that one day American citizens will also be able to live in a flat tax nation.
I appreciate the thought.
Thank you, Alvin.
Thank you.
Today, nearly 300 million citizens in post-communist Eastern Europe are economically freer with a flat tax which was spread by Dr. Rabushka, a senior fellow at Hoover Institution and tax policy advisor to President Reagan. On the other hand, more than 300 million Americans experience the highest corporate tax rate in the world at 39.2% and collect less corporate tax than any other nation in the world, which can be attributed to special interest lobbying. As Dr. Rabushka mentioned on America's Roundtable, the flat tax would drastically simplify our complicated tax code, increase tax revenue, and allow taxpayers to fill out their taxes on the back of a postcard.
We must remind ourselves that China and India do benefit from flat tax jurisdictions. Hong Kong's 17.5% corporate and 16% personal tax rate, and Mauritius 15% for corporate and personal taxes. These jurisdictions, Hong Kong and Mauritius, are gateways for investments in the emerging economic powerhouses of China and India. Take note, Dr. Rabushka's book, The Flat Tax, has been published into Chinese with a preface by a senior official in China's Ministry of Finance. Can you imagine what would happen if China and India introduced it to nearly 2.5 billion taxpayers? It will unleash even higher rates of economic growth. The flat tax revolution has reduced tax rates around the world. The race is on. Let reform laggards take note.